So today I want to talk about Benton Harbor, lead, and the water supply. The United States has a lead problem. A lot of the country has lead water pipes that, due to age and issues around corrosion, are increasingly leading to lead leaching into drinking water. We've known about the potential for this problem as a society, and we've known most of the negative effects of lead since most of those pipes were put into the ground or into people's homes. And yet, due to cost, simplicity, and some lobbying from utility companies, many homes and water service lines in the United States still contain lead. The fact of the matter is that where there is lead in pipes, eventually there will be lead in water, and eventually people will drink it. There are ways to deal with this, two of them as a matter of fact. The smart one, as far as I'm concerned, is to take the lead pipes out of the ground and replace them with something else. The alternative is to use certain methods that will actually limit the amount of lead that will leach out from the pipes into the water supply. And when Congress banned new lead pipes from being put into the ground in 1986, they opted for this limiting option because utility companies and Congress worked together because neither wanted to foot the bill to replace all of that old infrastructure. This required that older pipes be consistently monitored and water go through regular testing in order to detect any sort of potential contamination. Of course, this hasn't gone well, as we've seen a lot of places, especially recently, discover that they had lead in their water supplies. However, they knew then, just as they know now, and just as I previously mentioned, that the only way to get lead out of the water supply is to get rid of lead pipes. We've had over 30 years at this point to move in the direction of fixing this since the ban, and realistically, we've known since most of those pipes have gone into the ground that they were potentially going to cause harm and be dangerous to people. So we've had all this time to replace that infrastructure, and instead, we've chosen to put people at risk and put people's lives in danger. With that in mind, I want to explore what's happening right now in Benton Harbor, Michigan, only 3 hours from Flint, Michigan, who recently had a lot of the same issues with their water supply. And I want to talk about how this plan of keeping the pipes in the ground has worked out for the people there. So we have here that more lead-tainted water in Michigan draws attention to nation's aging pipes. During the 3 years that officials have known about dangerous amounts of lead flowing from faucets in Benton Harbor, Michigan, they sent out notices, distributed filters, and tried to improve water treatment. But the problems persisted, and some residents said that they never heard about the risks of toxic water coming from their taps. So yeah, this is an area that's known about this problem for 3 years, and I also need to point out that all levels of lead are dangerous, but they had just reached a level that's considered dangerous and extreme by the EPA. And when they reached that point, they were supposed to notify people. But of course, many people didn't find out about it, many people didn't receive the notices, and many people didn't get access to the filters. And the water treatment improvements that they tried to perform failed, probably due to aging infrastructure and again due to the levels of corrosion. Now, what they typically try to do in these treatment processes is they try to put some sort of chemical in that will bind to the walls and create a mineral layer that will prevent the lead from leaching out. However, if you see something like a change in water supply or a change in the acidity of water or any other number of factors that could come into play, you could see a lot of that get stripped right out and lead leach right back into the water. But if people don't know this, they don't know to take safe precautions. And for 3 years, that means people have been drinking lead without being fully aware of it. Now, in scenes reminiscent of the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, state officials have told Benton Harbor residents not to drink, cook, or brush their teeth with tap water. Obviously, because it's dangerous. But again, they took 3 years to fully let people know. Residents of Benton Harbor see parallels between their plight and the water crisis that unfolded less than 3 hours up the highway in Flint, also a majority black city, where a change in the water source in 2014 led to residents drinking contaminated water despite repeated assurances that it was safe. And just like it was, they were given repeated assurances in Flint in 2014, the people of Benton Harbor were not properly informed. And again, this is interesting that it's happening in another major black city, because at the end of the day, it's not happening across in other areas where there's majority white populations. And we'll get to that and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But the fact of the matter is, when we're dealing with this particular instance and situation, people there are not being told what's happening. And just like I said before, all it took was a change in the water supply. You take in more acidic water, you take in water with less minerals in it, and suddenly you've got a crisis on your hand with these lead pipes. And that's why they all need to be taken out of the ground. Now, across the country, in cities like Chicago, Pittsburgh, Clarksburg, West Virginia, Americans are actually drinking a dangerous amount of quantities of this brain damaging chemical, which is lead. And agencies are struggling to modernize water treatment plants and launch effective efforts to replace these lead service lines that connect buildings to the water system. Health officials remind that there is no safe level of lead exposure. We've basically just been living off of our great-grandparents' and grandparents' investments in our water infrastructure and not dealing with the festering problems, said Eric D. Olson of the Natural Resources Defense Council, an advocacy group in Benton that is fostering for action to get rid of and address the contamination. Now, the Biden administration has claimed that it's a priority in the infrastructure bill, but we've seen how that's going. We know that the infrastructure bill has been watered down, has been broken down, that we've seen consistent areas where the Republicans have made demands and then further prevented the bill. Manchin and Sinema, preventing the filibuster from being eradicated, have made it so that we can't even get anything passed. And so at the end of the day, a lot of the Republicans are going to get their way, and we're not going to have proper funding to make sure that we can actually replace these types of lead pipes. That is my biggest fear when it comes to all of this. With all of the infrastructure that needs to be replaced in the United States, I believe piping is among the biggest ones. And unfortunately, it's not being dealt with. And there's no money being allocated for it. And amid the uncertainty about whether the bill and an expensive domestic policy package will pass, and how much money would eventually make it into small communities like this one, the prospect of congressional help feels remote to many in Benton Harbor. And that's the issue. This is something that needs to be addressed on a much larger scale. You can't be dealing with, under our current economic system and the way that the state typically functions, you can't deal with this by just having these small areas pay for it. And one, if the money does come from the federal government, it ends up at the state level. And the question is, will the state, in fact, put and allocate the money to these areas for them to get their lead pipes fixed? Or will they seek other projects that might benefit corporations and might, be more lucrative in the long run, rather than helping these small areas, especially these communities of color? And that's how a lot of these practices from the federal government sending money down to these areas end up getting intercepted and end up making it so that there's an unequitable distribution or inequitable distribution of these resources, and that communities of color typically end up on the back end of. So when we look more into this, in Wichita, Kansas, hundreds of thousands of people were placed under boil water advisories recently after a decades-old pipe had burst. In Jackson, Mississippi, a winter storm froze pipes, which I've covered on this channel, and much of the city was under boil advisory for weeks, which is nothing new to Jackson, Mississippi, because they have those pretty much every year and several times a year, because they're almost always under a boil water advisory. And in parts of the American West, as I've covered as well, we know that lengthy droughts have exacerbated water shortages. The fact of the matter is that when we take all of that, and then the New Jersey incident where lead water was actually an issue there, which I believe we'll go over very shortly, the fact of the matter is that all of these areas have a piping issue. America has an issue with decades-old pipes that are consistently under strain and stress and are practically falling apart at this point. They're constantly bursting and they're constantly in need of repair. And one of the other problems is that up until recently, a lot of those repairs were done with lead-based sealants. And there's still a certain amount of percent of lead that's allowed in those sealants to reseal up those pipes, meaning that a lot of these repair jobs are also leaching lead. And unfortunately, that's where we're sitting. And the country's sitting at a C- grade from the American Society of Civil Engineers when it comes to water infrastructure. And so between lead and these bursting pipes and all other shapes and forms, including iron ones, we're seeing a major impact of rust in water, of lead in water. And while rust is typically considered safe and not dangerous the way lead is, it still can end up affecting the overall chemistry of these pipes. So, yeah, they're basically handing out water en masse to people in order for them to survive. And I need to remind people that this bottled water comes from somewhere. I know a lot of people are like, oh, we'll just hand out bottled water until we can replace things. That's a temporary solution and measure. I do agree with that. People need to drink water, and I'm not advocating in any way that we don't actually hand out these water to the people in these areas. My issue is that we can't rely on it as a solution. We need to come up with a better one that deals with the actual infrastructure. Because if you're taking water from other areas, eventually, with the water crisis that seems to be looming in this country, where there's droughts amongst the West, and there's other areas of the country that will likely experience water markets as things are moving in the coming years, water bottles aren't exactly the best thing for the climate, nor are they the best thing for water supplies right now. And we should be thinking about how to fix this long term and make sure people will have drinking water in 30 to 40 years. For many in the city, water is just one more indignity, and some cannot help but wonder if the situation would be different in Benton Harbor's population if they were wealthier and whiter. Across the bridge in St. Joseph, a majority white city, there is no such emergency. This is all too common. In Jackson, Mississippi, the suburbs to the north, is majority white as well, and they don't seem to have the issue with pipes bursting that Jackson, Mississippi does when it's a majority black city. And this is a story that just seems to be repeating on itself over and over again, where you end up with these communities of color where their pipes are bursting, they're getting lead in their water supply, and of course that's going to have a ton of negative impact. And at the end of the day, we end up in a situation where the white suburb nearby seems squeaky clean and fine, and isn't exactly dealing with any of these issues. And yet we're supposed to pretend that this isn't somehow racist policy, or that the funds are being allocated properly, and that if the funds do in fact come from the Biden administration, that they will be allocated in a way that will actually help communities of color. I'm suspicious at best, and the people in these neighborhoods generally are as well, and they have every reason and right to be. Some people are still alive where where blacks had their own water fountain and whites had theirs, said Dwayne Seats II, Benton Harbor's mayor pro tem, and the pastor of a church hosting bottled water giveaways. So what's the difference in this situation now? And that, to me, speaks to the level of systemic inequality and injustice that goes underreported and ends up sliding through the cracks just because it's not explicit anymore. Just because there isn't something like a black and white water fountain doesn't mean that there isn't black and white drinking water, that there isn't a black and white reality in the United States, and that neighborhoods of color often end up in positions where they are treated far worse and have a lot of these negative situations happen, like the water supply, like not having chain stores come in and want to sell things to them, like being in food deserts. All of these things happen, and they're real instances of people of color living a different life. That's not even including policing and mass incarceration and all of the other factors that come into play with that. And it just builds on itself, one thing after another, that just provides a really different life than what a lot of white Americans grow up dealing with. Now, it's also worth noting when we're talking about lead, what exactly happens with lead? Well, lead is known to damage the brain, the nervous system, impair growth, and continue to contribute to behavioral problems, especially with children. The effects in children are really, really terrible. And if we look into this, what the World Health Organization talks about, young children are particularly vulnerable to the toxic effects of lead and can suffer profound and permanent adverse health impacts, particularly on the development of the brain and nervous system. Lead also causes long-term harm in adults, including increased risk of high blood pressure and kidney damage. Exposure of pregnant women to high levels of lead can cause miscarriage, stillbirth, premature birth, and low birth weight, all of which predominantly affect children. And if this is happening more so in neighborhoods of color, you can figure out which children are the most affected. At high levels of exposure, lead attacks the brain and central nervous system, causing coma, convulsions, and even death. Children who survive severe lead poisoning may be left with intellectual disability and behavioral disorders. At lower levels of exposure that cause no obvious symptoms, lead is known to produce a spectrum of injury across multiple body spectrums. In particular, lead can affect children's brain development, resulting in reduced intelligence quotient or IQ. Now, there's a lot of racist, very racist, scientific racist arguments that are made about IQ when it comes to people of color. Is it possible that a lot of that is actually tied to some of the lead in drinking water and paint that's left over in, housing that's provided to a lot of communities of color? Is it possible that that's something that's being implemented and affected by the state, whether purposefully or otherwise, that's having an effect on populations and, lowering IQ levels? Probably. That's a more realistic explanation than any of the scientific racism out there. But I do need to mention that is quite apparent in a lot of different communities. That is a narrative that is still being perpetuated, and it is a disturbing trend that unfortunately I felt like I needed to address right now, because I think we should be at the point where we acknowledge that all of that scientific racism is absolute bunk. Behavioral changes such as reduced attention spans and increased antisocial behavior, and reduced educational attainment. Lead exposure also causes anemia, hypertension, renal impairment, immunotoxicity, and toxicity to reproductive organs. The neurological and behavioral effects of lead are believed to be irreversible. There we go, right there. So 3 years, Benton Harbor has been in a situation where people have been drinking water from the tap without being told, and that means children were exposed to it for 3 years. So you had little 2-year-olds drinking water right out of the tap, thinking it was perfectly safe, and now they have lead poisoning. And now they will be affected likely for the rest of their lives. Again, there is no safe blood lead concentration. Even blood lead concentrations as 5 micrograms per deciliter may be associated with decreased intelligence in children, behavioral difficulties, and learning problems. As lead exposure increases, the range of severity of symptoms and effects also increase, and it should also be noted that since children are tinier and smaller, it affects them in lesser quantities of lead in the water. And so, this is where we're sitting at. And when we look into the state of the United States, we find out that nearly 51% actually have detectable levels of lead in their blood. This is children. 51% of children have detectable levels of lead in their blood. And yet we're talking about whether or not we should be replacing lead pipes? Are we serious here? About 2% had levels at or above the 5 micrograms per deciliter, which, as we just saw, can have long-term permanent impacts. The level at which the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention recommends public health actions. That percentage was down more than 36% since a previous study, which was based on data from 2009 to 2015. Now, there are some key findings that I want to point out. 6 in 10 children living in areas with poverty had detectable levels of lead in their blood, compared with 39% of kids in the least impoverished areas. Children in high poverty areas were nearly 3 times more likely to have elevated lead levels than kids from areas with the lowest levels of poverty. So poverty is a huge factor for whether or not you have lead in your blood. And of course, because of the disadvantages that already come with poverty, now you're adding low IQ to all of that, as well as a bunch of other factors, that including behavioral disorders and inability to retain information, which is going to make it that much harder for these children to succeed in their lives because of the way our school system functions and because of so much more of how our society functions. Now, in all, 58% of children from predominantly black neighborhoods had detectable lead levels in their blood, compared with 49% of kids in white neighborhoods, meaning that it is affecting people of color in a disproportionate way. About 3% of kids from black neighborhoods, 2% from white neighborhoods, and 1% from Hispanic neighborhoods had elevated blood levels. And if we look into it, there are certain states that have higher percentages, where Nebraska has 83%, Missouri 82%, Michigan 78%, Iowa 76%, and Utah 73%. And elevated blood levels are Nebraska 6%, Ohio 5%, Pennsylvania 5%, Missouri 5%, Michigan 5%, and Wisconsin 4%. This is disturbing, the amount of lead that we are seeing in children. Now, when we go back, I just want to briefly load up that article from New Jersey because this has been happening in a lot of different areas. We have here tainted water ignores warnings and boss with a criminal past. Basically, in the years after receiving test results showing alarming levels of lead in the city's drinking water, Mayor Ras Baraka of Newark made a number of unexpected decisions. He mailed a brochure to all city residents assuring them that the quality of water meets all federal and state standards. He declared the water safe and then condemned in capital letters on the city's website outrageously false statements to the contrary. So quite like what's happening in Benton Harbor, we have an issue here, where because these cities don't want to pay for a change in infrastructure, they're lying to people and saying that it's fine and just trying to cover it up and make it appear, at the very least, like they're able to limit the supply of lead in the water over time and that people will be safe. And this is something that I think is happening quite consistently and might even be underreported across the country. And that's disturbing, again, to see. Now, I want to bring up one more set of information when it comes to Benton Harbor. We have an image on screen of somebody volunteer preparing gallons of water to be distributed to people. And as we scroll through, we have that under a proposal from Whitmer, the pipes would be removed over the course of 5 years. That's not fast enough, and that's not good enough. And it's disturbing to me that it's convenient for them to say, oh, well, we'll just replace the pipes in 5 years. So do you expect people to be drinking bottled water and boiling their water for 5 years' time? And again, they can't even boil their water or use the tap water to brush their teeth because there's a risk of intaking lead. So they literally have to rely on the state providing some sort of bottled water to them for 5 years in order to get pipes cleared. That's expensive. It would be much cheaper and much more affordable in the long run to just replace the pipes and to just get them done in a quick fashion. Now, when we talk more about this, it's unclear how the project will be funded. Republican-controlled Michigan legislature agreed to only half of the $20 million that it would cost. And Joe Biden's infrastructure bills, again, may go to this if it actually passes. But again, we know where that's at. Now, Eric Olson, the Senior Strategic Director for Health at the NRDC, expressed concern in a previous interview with The Guardian that any cuts to pipe removal funding in the final bills could come at the expense of disadvantaged communities like Benton Harbor. Yeah, no joke. And yet Republicans keep saying, oh, we can't come up with the money. But yet we as a federal government can develop and come up with all this money to pay for weapons of war, to develop new tools, to pay for other countries' militaries to get expanded. But we cannot, in fact, pay $20 million, which is a fraction of the billions of dollars we spend in military budgets, to make sure that this area has proper drinking water in an efficient manner. Meanwhile, residents and their advocates say that the 5-year timetable proposed by Whitmer is too long and have been pushing for an accelerated pace, citing the speed with which far larger cities like Newark, New Jersey, had moved to replace its lead pipes since early 2019. It removed more than 20,000 service lines. And you know what? Newark got caught with what they did, and they replaced the pipes. At the very least, they're holding on and doing that. People have called that in Benton Harbor lines to be replaced within only 1 to 2 years. We can't wait any longer. However, only 100 pipes are slated to be removed by next spring. And again, 1 to 2 years I think is quite a reasonable amount of time for an area like Benton Harbor. We're not talking a major city. We're not talking about Newark. We're not talking about New York City. We're not talking about San Francisco. There's very little reason why this can't actually happen. Now, with all of this, we need to recognize that that these are the acceptable parameters that have been enabled. We've enabled this. We've allowed Congress to do what it does. We've allowed the utility companies to lobby the way they have. We have enabled this poor infrastructure to continue to exist. We enabled it by putting the lead pipes in the ground. We enabled it by ignoring it for years. We enabled it by making it so that in 1986, when the lead pipes were banned, we didn't set a plan to replace all this infrastructure a long time ago. And in the response, the outcome of all of this has been the contamination of people with lead, which is going to have long-term impacts on children. This is the struggle of Benton Harbor. This is the struggle of places like Flint, Michigan. And this is the struggle of places like Newark, New Jersey, and all of the other communities that I've mentioned and that are going underreported, where they're dealing with similar piping and lead issues. It's time to stop seeing infrastructure as an externality to pass on to others and to start developing real ways to deal with this sort of problem on a mass scale, instead of cutting corners, limiting funding, or dealing with this on a case-by-case basis until the next lead crisis happens. We shouldn't have to wait until a crisis occurs and becomes a part of the public attention before we actually deal with it. These need to be addressed en masse. So with that said, if you like this video, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check me out on Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you for watching.